So I'd just like to welcome you all to the State Library of Queensland today. We're having a shipping and immigration and shipping session on what is available online. And as you will have seen, we have the Queensland State Archives, National Archives of Australia and the State Library all collaborating to present this session. So today I'd just like to introduce our speakers. Firstly, we have Saadia Thomson Dwyer over there from Queensland State Archives. She's a senior archivist in the Public Access Unit. She has 28 years experience in the industry. She supervises the QSA volunteer indexing program and has done for many years. So QSA hold a wealth of valuable indexes which help researchers use their collections in a very meaningful way. Our second speaker will be Cara Downs from the National Archives. Cara's down the front here. Cara Downs has worked for the National Archives of Australia in the areas of public access for over 10 years, initially starting her career at the Archives Canberra office as a graduate. Another aspect of Cara's work is the provision of copyright advice and permissions for Commonwealth records held in the Archives collection. Cara has a strong archival background and has also worked overseas for the Oxford University Archives. Our third speaker today is Stephanie Ryan from the State Library of Queensland. She's been a research librarian here in family history at the State Library for over 22 years. She's participated in radio and television programs and has been interviewed for newspaper and magazine articles for her specialist knowledge. She contributes to the State Library of Queensland blogs and writes articles on family history. So Stephanie's part of the State Library of Queensland family history team, and they also conduct, as well as this presentation, other presentations. So we have some more coming up in September. We also present for societies, libraries and the general public. We have lots of information guides that are all available on the web, and there's also a curated collection of useful websites for family historians. So have a look at the State Library pages when you've got time. So I would like to now hand over to Saadia and we'll get the day going. Okay.
Thanks, Margaret. Just bear with me, I'm not tall and I have a very bright light in my eyes. Thank you for coming, everybody, and welcome along to our talk this morning. As you'll see from today, the three different organisations that are here, we have very different records, very different perspectives and different finding aids and the way we assist our clients as well. So hopefully you'll get a lot out of today on the different types of collections that we hold and how our staff can assist you and what sort of fabulous research you can undertake. To bear with me with the gadgets. So for those of you, hands up, who here knows what State Archives is all about? Sort of, most of you, some of you. Okay, just a quick refresher in case you weren't sure. Queensland State Archives operates under the Public Records Act of 2002 and prior to that Libraries and Archives Act of 1949. We are the custodian of Queensland's largest and most significant documentary heritage collection and the primary source records that were created by the government. They document our social, political and cultural history for all Queenslanders. Most records were created from 1859 in the colonial period. However, we do have a body of records that does go as early as 1824, although I have found an Admiralty map which is dated 1822. We have records that deal with lands, immigration and everything else in between that is of a government nature. We currently have, last count was 63 lineal kilometres of records. They're stored in our purpose-built repositories, which are state-of-the-art and beautiful. Very chilly, but that's good for the records. So that's what we call controlled conditions, where we regulate the temperature and the humidity and all those sorts of things. We have about roughly 5 million actual records, about 2 million pages of records. That doesn't include our AV collection and other artefacts that are held. And we basically only collect those records which have been deemed as permanent, that were created by Queensland State Government departments, agencies and authorities, statutory corporate those sorts of things within Queensland Government. So that's about 600 different agencies at last count. So you know what we do. So what we're looking at today is immigration, voyages to Queensland, and the different types of legislation and how that affects your research, because the legislation stipulates what sort of records had to be kept. The types of passage, because you could come out as a variety of passages, and some people came out more than once because they kept going home to another land, and the different types of immigrants that arrived. And we'll also have a look at our immigration records and the different resources that we have available at state archives. So, and throughout this seminar, you see lovely little pictures from our collection. And this one was the first government-sponsored immigrant ship, the Artemisia, that arrived in 1848. So, basically, we hold immigration records for those people who came to Queensland ports as their first destination. So if you're looking for people that stopped at Sydney or Adelaide or Perth or Hobart or anywhere in between first, before they came to Queensland, so they overlanded or came by coastal punt, we won't have records because their immigration point of departure was that other colony. So we have the records for those people that arrived in Moreton Bay. They didn't stop anywhere else for a short sojourn. The records we have all came under government schemes, and there were quite a variety of schemes depending on the era. The majority of the records are actually for assisted immigrants. So if your people were full payers, nobody sponsored them, the government didn't assist them, they paid their own way, you have a much smaller chance of finding them within our collection, because basically the government didn't have to chase them for any money, so they weren't interested. That's the bottom line, the mighty dollar. But we'll talk a little bit more about that further on. As an idea of the impact of how many immigrants we've had since the 1840s onwards, we're looking at over 600,000 assisted immigrants who arrived purely between 1901 and 1940 alone. And of that 600,000, 471,000 plus were assisted. So for the 20th century, that's a huge number of records. What we don't have are those people who immigrated from the Americas, the Asias, or African countries, or even our mates across the ditch in New Zealand. We also do not hold departure records. Quite often people will come to us and say, I'm trying to look for evidence, great-granddad, we know he went back to England, have you got any records on his departure? Victoria was pretty much the only state that kept departure records. Queensland didn't, because again, the government wasn't interested in who was leaving, only interested in who was coming in. We don't have departures to other Australian colonies either in the 19th century. So what it's all about is the legislation. And it's the nitty-gritty that tells you what all the rules and regulations were, what people had to pay, who qualified, what records the immigration agents and the sub-agents had to collect. And it varied quite significantly over the decades, and the legislation changed over time according to the economics of the time, but also according to population requirements, because they sort of came to a period of time where they realised there were lots of blokes in the colony and not enough ladies. So what are you going to recruit? That's right, more women of marriageable age who can create little babies to build the population, that's right. So, for example, during 1861 to 1865, almost 53,000 people entered Queensland, compared to the following decade, where there were only just 15,000 people coming in. And that was due to a massive economic downturn. And if you're really into social history, look at what was happening in the wider world at those periods of time. So in the 1850s, you had this little thing happening up near Mr. Putin's territory called the Crimean War. So when you've got wars happening, all your menfolk are off to war. When they come back, what's the thing that tends to happen? That's right. Aside from the fact there's no TV and they had to do something with the time, and they got friendly again, they rebuild the farm, so they tend to stay put. Then if things aren't going too well, then they start looking at where are there other options for us to live, where there's a better economy. So you get these periods of war, not a lot of immigration. After war, immigration sort of goes up. So it's very much this sort of wave-like flow chart if you look at it. Then you have to look at much later, from 1881, immigration goes back up again, and this is where all these labour schemes come in. So your domestic labour scheme, your farm labour scheme, and your assisted immigration scheme, where you've got about 82,000 people arriving within a 5-year period. So it's very ebb and flow. The legislation outlines the eligibility, the categories of immigrants, what the immigrants actually had to do, so their commitments. So they actually had some burdens placed upon them. One of them was they weren't allowed to transport their feather beds. Yes, it is actually worded like that in the legislation, no feather beds. Employers who were sponsoring them had commitments about ensuring that they had work to go to and accommodation. And there were breaches and penalties, so you could be fined usually. In worst cases, more in the 20th century, you might be sent back home. There were scales for payments, depending on which category you were in, and the different types of forms that were used. So there weren't just immigration agents here in Queensland, there were also immigration agents in England and also on the continent. Every applicant for a free passage was required to pay the sum of £1 for every member of their family who counted as an adult. So anyone over the age of 14 usually counted as an adult. They had to pay it in 2 instalments, so it was an upfront instalment, and then after they got here, anywhere within the first 12 to 24 months, they had to pay back that second instalment. So this is why the government was more interested in documenting the assisted immigrants, because there was that financial transaction. They wanted to make sure they got their money's worth and their money. So it says here, the sum of £16 sterling per statute adult was the estimated cost of passage. The number of passengers had to be in proportion of a 2/3 capacity of the ship, because obviously they had to have cargo and all the ration supplies as well. And that is that 1/2 of that, in equal proportions of immigrants, had to come to Brisbane, and the rest could go to other ports in Queensland. So they couldn't sort of, hop ship wherever they felt like it, because they'd get tracked. But I'd like to see any records on that yet. We've never found any records on someone who didn't pay up and ran away. The legislation also gives us luggage limits. This is where we get the interesting things about feather beds. So in the 19th century, it was quite different to the 20th century, where we find people are packing their motorcycles and beach chairs. They weren't allowed to bring any bulky agricultural equipment, no furniture. If you think about feather beds, aside from the bulk, what do you think would have been the other issue? Bugs and quarantine, exactly. All those itchy, crawly mites. Yuck. They probably had a few other issues on the boats as well. It wasn't allowed to exceed 20 cubic feet, which is actually a pretty large amount of stuff you can bring, especially if you've got 10 kids. Per adult, so you add that, you've got a family of 6, that's a lot of stuff you can bring. However, it couldn't exceed 1/2 tonne. So, bit of a conundrum there. Everything had to be divided up into boxes, and so they could pack everything. So nothing circular. You get much more packing space out of boxes. Now, the surgeon superintendent also travelled on the ship with the captain and usually your first mate and purser and all those other dudes. And you also had a matron who looked after the children and single women, but they obviously would have recruited mothers on the voyage to assist with the wrangling of said children. The surgeon was allowed a separate cabin. He was given 40 feet of space to hold his own luggage, because obviously he might need some medical stuff in there. And each passenger was assigned 16 feet of space, so it was very up close and personal, except for married couples who were actually allowed to have 18 feet between them in the deck in which they are berthed. So that was very much for, not tonight, dear, I've got a headache. There were limits on the clothing and requirements of the type of clothing that actually had to bring. So you can see by the list it's different for the blokes as it is for the ladies. I like the fact that ladies had to wear 2 strong gowns or have 2 strong gowns, so no evening gowns. And according to the Immigration Act of 1869, persons must bring their own clothing. They will be inspected and not allowed on board if the minimum quantities of supplies are not met. Obviously for laundry reasons, I would say. Other supplies. Now, whilst they weren't allowed to bring a feather bed, they still had to supply a bed for themselves. So, does anyone here know the joys of lace making? Nobody puts their hand up? Why I say that is because you make your lace beds out of straw. So, it's an interesting aside that immigration, often they used to make their pallets out of straw, and then after that, easily turf it over the side, mulch it down. But the ladies could use it to pack down to make their lace pillows. so that they could continue on with their handicrafts because that provided them with an income. So it was your bed could be very versatile for a variety of reasons. The supplies were required for the journey. So this is the list of the supplies that you can see here. Did that go forward? There we go. They had to be paid for and collected when joining the ship. If you were willing to pay almost double the amount that was required, you could have things like an extra pair of sheets, very exciting, a pillow, a counterpane, which is like a summer quilt, and a slop pail. Don't forget your slop pail. And your 3 pounds of marine soap. So the fares, these notices show that nominated immigrants, so this is 1891 and 1929, and I don't know if you can read them clearly, but you'll see that for males in the nominated one to my right, your left, they paid, I think it says £3, and it depended on their ages too. So if they're under 12, it was 3. If they were up to 40, it was 5. Then you look 1929, which is a lot later, and you'll see it's significantly jumped in price. So depending on the economy, depended on how much people were charged. For many years, we didn't believe we had tickets. People used to ask us what were the tickets like that people bought in order to hop on a boat. And whilst doing some research for the banners that you'll see outside and the voyages to Queensland, I actually came across some immigration agent for Henry Jordan. He was immigration agent based in London. In his correspondence bundles, this actual contract ticket. So what it gives you, there are 3 sections. So the very first section on your left is the bit that the ship's captain kept, or the shipping line kept. The bit in the middle was your passage document that allowed you to get from A to B. This bit on the end, the little certificate, this is actually what a landlord certificate looked like. So it was valued to a certain amount, and then the instructions tell you what you were to do with it. So you take it, you go through the immigration department, then you go down to the Crown Commissioner of Land, you fork this over, they have a look at it and they say, where would you like to go? You can get £18 land order transfer. You might have half a dozen members in your family, they all have their own ticket, you can get quite a sizable block. And if you're really savvy and you go, well, we have people we know that live around Toowoomba, we know the land's good up there, we'll take some land up there. They'd write out a chit, they'd take off up to Toowoomba on the Cobb & Co coach, they'd go see the Crown Commissioner Land agent up there, and then they'd sign it off. We only have one record that translates a land order certificate like this into actual land. That's been indexed, and that's under the lands indexes on our website, and that is the only record we have that relates directly from a land order to actually owning land, and it gives you all what we call these days the RP data. So have a look at that. This ticket allows you to travel for a voyage anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months, depending on whether you're under full sail, a combination of steam and sail, or steam. Accommodation was first, second and third class, saloon, intermediate, cabin and steerage. Nobody wanted steerage. There were separate quarters for single males and single females and married immigrants. The ship's captain also recorded births and deaths, the odd but rare marriage, and what illnesses were aboard, mainly for quarantine purposes. Aside from the matron and the surgeon, if there are lots of children on board, they would often engage a schoolmaster as well. And the women and children, as I said earlier, came under the watchful eye of the matron. Surgeons and teachers, they were required under the Queensland legislation, and they had a duty of care to everyone on board. Single women were not to leave their quarters except to the permitted sections of the deck for daily exercise, and propriety was expected to control any misbehaviour at all times. The master will be instructed strictly to prevent the officers and the crew from entering any single women's cabins or married people's compartments of the ship. They were not allowed to fraternise. We also find lists within the legislation of the provisions that people were given, and it's all the different types of foodstuffs. So without dwelling on it for too long, they had lovely culinary delights such as corned beef, salted pork, York ham, ox tongues, breadstuffs, which were rice, milk, flour, pearl barley, vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, and anything that could be put in soup, and sundries like coffee, sugar, chocolate, jams, jellies, figs and spices. Each passenger was allowed up to, as part of their provisions, 24 bottles of port wine, 12 bottles of sherry, 3/4 gallon of gin. So you were probably smashed by the time you got to Moreton Bay. Because wait, there's more. 3 gallons of brandy, 25 dozens of imperial pints of stout. So they didn't drink a lot of water in those days or fruit juice. But only approved brands. Medicinal purposes. Wink, wink. Children, so infants, they had slightly different categories. They didn't get any of the alcohol. They got preserved milk, condensed eggs, or one fresh egg every alternate day if they could get them. Infants, biscuits, oatmeal, sago, flour, rice and sugar. They could supply water distilling equipment if required on board. Isn't it just painting a lovely picture of 19th century immigration? So the duties of the surgeon. So for example, we have here a report from the Surgeon Superintendent of the Storm King. So the bit that's in the box, he's talking about the sickness. So they used to get, the Romans used to call it barrack fever. You stick a lot of people in a tight space with not a lot of air and very good hygiene, you end up with horrible things like typhoid and scarlet fever and measles and lots of those highly communicable diseases. The surgeon would be responsible for appointing the matron and any constables who had to carry out watch. Some ships you'll find there's lots of correspondence about biffos between the crew and the passengers, between the crew on their own, between the passengers, fighting over rations because they've been becalmed, and the 6-week voyage actually took 3.5 months. So there's lots of correspondence that you can get through our index to ships, which is a card index available in the public search room. The sergeant also took reports of neglect or refusal, and he approved the payment of gratuities for any duties that may have been performed by passengers at his request. He was appointed with a base wage, and then he received a certain amount of, like a commission almost, upon his arrival per immigrant that was delivered. So that doesn't necessarily mean delivering babies, that means getting your immigrants to the port in good health. And if their health wasn't good or maintained, he might not get his bonuses. So this one on the Storm King, it was a trip from London to Brisbane, and the official report occurred during the passage of 88 days, having left Gravesend on October 21 in 1869 and arrived in Moreton Bay on the 17th of January 1870. So it took about 3 months. And he's talking about the illness and the accidents which occurred. There was a fracture of a hand to one fellow. Another one had a fall and retained a scalp wound. So they give you quite, and then he actually names the passengers. So if you do find a health report for the ship your people travelled on, have a good read. You might be a little bit more illuminating on the conditions of their voyage. We have a variety of health officers' reports aside from the written correspondence ones. By the late 1860s, they start doing these forms where they basically just have to fill in the blanks. So these are some examples from the Queen of the Colonies reports. So it arrived in 1865. There were 511 immigrants, 45 crew, and the ship was racked with typhoid and diarrhoea. One does give you the other. So that would not have been a very pleasant voyage. The Schoolmaster was charged with looking after all children aged between 5 and 15, and they had to attend school. So they probably had lessons in the morning and then were free to run amok on the decks later in the afternoon. He had to keep a diary, and that had to be shown to the immigration agent when he arrived. And then that was delivered to the Agent General once the ship was returned to London. So we don't have a lot of these records because of that being passed on through different custodies. If the schoolmaster neglected his office, the surgeon was charged to remove and replace him. So this is why you wanted to have some other educated people on board so they could teach the children, so they needed to be able to read and write. This letter mentions Emily and Louise Whalley and Elizabeth Kemp, who deserve special mention for their attention to and progress in their studies, and to whom the teacher had awarded prizes. So anyway, and I also noticed there's John and William Eglinton, who are also recorded in there, and they deserved repeated mentioning for their good behaviour. So the types of immigrants. There were a few. There were bounty immigrants, that was in the very early system. The assisted passage immigrants, free passage, which means you didn't have to pay anything up front. Indentured passages, so they're like your trade apprentices and other trades. Nominated or remittance passengers, which almost the same thing, and then you've got your full payer. So an immigrant, spelt a variety of ways, was any person who had obtained a free, assisted or nominated passage to the colony under the provisions of any of the Immigration Acts. And they came on a specifically nominated Queensland Government immigration ship. The other thing is that the categories altered over the years as economic conditions changed in Queensland, which we said earlier. Now, outside, if you hadn't already collected it, you'll see Brief Guide 16 to immigration, and it actually gives you a full definition of each of those categories. So grab a copy of that and have a read. The bounty system, however, was slightly different. It involved the payment of set amounts of money, or bounties as they were called, per immigrant, to the people who arranged for and paid up front the passage for these people. So if you think of like the sheriff bounty system, like bounty hunters, it was a similar thing applied in an immigration sense. So that immigration agent who paid the bounties, or the shipping agents, it was in their best interest to ensure that if they had bountied 511 immigrants, they need to make sure there were 511 live bodies on that boat and 511 live bodies in good health that got off that boat, or they didn't get their money back. So it was quite an institution in its era. And it ensured that people were coming out here and were being looked after, because you often see in later health reports where the surgeons are complaining that the rations were contaminated, the food was contaminated, there wasn't enough of anything, the captains were neglecting their duties. So the bounty system was very good in that it kept people accountable. It was originally established in New South Wales in 1837 and was financed from the sale of Crown lands. So it was really instituted and used by the Queensland Cotton Company, the Queensland Immigration Society in the main, and you also hear of immigration agents such as Huesler, Brown and Frank. There are quite a number of them. They used this system very much during the 1860s and 70s. And it was also used to arrange for the passage of certain categories later on of immigrants, such as your female domestic servants, shepherds, mechanics and agricultural labourers, because they were work areas where we really needed the bodies. We'll just skip through some of these very quickly because they're just examples. This is an example of an immigration manifest. It goes through Townsville and stops at the different ports. And you can see it's actually broken up into the different types of passengers. So we've got your remittance and your free and your full payers. Pretty much all passenger lists gives you a little bit of detail about the name of the ship, where it left from, where it arrived, the name of the captain, the tonnage, the names of the surgeon and the matron. And then at the very end, a passenger list might be 1 page, it might be 10 pages. At the very end, there's always a summary, so you know exactly how many bodies there were. They might give you a breakdown of which countries they came from, as in, Wales, Ireland, England, Scotland. Sometimes they even give you the counties, which is really handy. With the free passages, they were granted to particular categories of immigrants and their families, and were from time to time required. They wanted to actually encourage entire families to come out as opposed to single people. The categories, again, like everything else, altered over the years. As we said earlier, when they realised the population was very high in Queensland for males, they needed to recruit females to balance it out. At some points in time, they recruited just married couples that didn't have any children. So it was a very fluid thing. Applicants were required to pay the sum of £1 and a similar amount for each member of the family in this period of time. So I think this one for the Quetta is in the 1880s, before it grounded. And then the rules that applied by this time was that to be eligible, they had to be unable to pay any amount of their own passage. They could not have resided previously in any Australian colony, and they must intend to reside permanently in Queensland. So the rules change. This one's an example of assisted passages, and it's pretty much the same sort of thing. Again, you'll find this is by, what's the date on that? I think it's about 1900 by this stage. We have changed to recruiting families that include farmers, farm labourers, vine dressers, labourers and mechanics, again, unable to pay their full passage, and the same thing, haven't resided in any other Australian colony and want to live in Queensland. A full payer, those paying the full amount of passage money, for whom the full amount could also have been paid by someone else. So you can be a full payer who's also technically a remittance passenger because someone else paid your way. And you find this is increasing in this period of time. as the next slide shows us. So a remittance passenger, or a nominated one, was someone who was a natural born or naturalised, we're all British in that era of time, and they were residing in Queensland. They desired to provide a passage to the colony for a friend or a relative from Europe. They could obtain a passage warrant from the government on the payment of the required amount. The warrant was then forwarded to the friend or relative in their country of origin. On the presentation of that warrant, so it's almost like that ticket we saw earlier, the government representative in Europe would then arrange for a passage of that immigrant. So that's how the nominated or remittance passengers system worked. And often in these records too, you get the name of the nominator as well as the nominee. You might get addresses for where the nominator lived, or at least a locality. So you're getting a little bit more information about who brought them out here. This is just some other examples of the documents you will find that relate to nominated and remittance type passengers. So we have some receipts, we also have deposits, and these cards. These items are all from indexes you will find online in our immigration suite of indexes, which covers now, I think, about 500,000 entries. We've got approximately 1.2 million entries online now, with about 82 indexes, and more coming. Watch this space. Indentured Passages, again, different sets of records. This was for a fellow called John Rennie. Now, an employer who wanted to secure the service of a particular trade, so they're very big on mechanics, servants and labourers. You get that right across the entire immigration time frame, would pay the money or arrange it as we said earlier. The employer in Queensland could authorise a representative in the Queensland government on their behalf, but by the sort of later periods, they're having to do that less and less. This particular one we have here is for the Assistant Immigration Agent in Bowen. And you get to see all those names. So we won't go too much on the bounty scheme, but the land order scheme is the one that people are more interested in, because a lot of people always think if it's land order, it relates to land. It's a big furphy and it's a giant carrot. It was just a way to get people to come. If you come, we will give you land. But they didn't always have to take up the land. What they could do was they could convert that land order voucher into money. They still had the time frame in which they had to pay it back, but it might allow them, especially if you weren't a farmer, or you knew you were a farmer and you weren't a very good farmer, you might decide to set up your own laundry business. It gave you cash to hand to help set yourself up. So I won't read it out, but they're the idea of how it worked. The conditions for land orders, much like the other immigration schemes, change continually throughout the legislation and the time frame. The value of the land orders changed. It could be £10, it could be £18, it could be £30. The amount of acreage that went with that value also changed. The areas in Queensland that were opened up for land order settlement changed regularly, depending on the population. And also sometimes they'd open up an area of land and you couldn't fatten a lizard on it. People would come back and go, give me another land order, that's hopeless. You get people walking off the land and they go, okay, we won't send many more people out the back of Warwick because it's not really very good for dairy cattle. We might send them somewhere else. And so the Immigration Department had to work quite closely with the Crown Commissioner of Lands. What they had to do, there were even more requirements placed on the immigrant if they were in a land order system. Before the end of 5 years, every applicant must prove to the satisfaction of the Land Commissioner that they had not alienated any part of the land, so it's like subdivided it, chopped it off for anybody else, that they had resided upon the land for 3 years continuously, they had cultivated 1/10 of the land, or if they didn't cultivate that 1/10, they had fenced in the whole land with a good and substantial fence. You also had to have a dwelling as well. Then after that period of time, you've sort of worked off your nominal rent that you'd paid and your land order amount, it would convert to freehold. So you could end up, if you know where to look, you know your person came out in a land order, you found the passenger record that proves that the first time you find them in as a male over the age of 25, owning the land, in the electoral rolls, that's quite possibly the land that they got in their land order, unless they moved around a lot. How to search our immigration records. We have the brief guide, which I mentioned earlier, which is outside for you. We also have a search procedure that you can use in our public search room. It's called search procedure number 16 on immigration. We have a pathways guidebook on immigration, which you can use in the public search room. And if we have any old spare copies, they're free, you just ask for them. We have a list of all ships that arrived into Queensland available in the public search room. It's called IMM 111. It has also been digitised, so you can now look at that from the safety and comfort of your own living room through our catalogue. We have quite a large number of indexes available online for immigration. A few of those have digital records attached. Quite a few of them we have now digitised the records, and we are adding those links to the indexes, but it might take another 6 months before those go up online, as we still experience some technical issues with our online indexing. Yes, we know, we're still working on it. But keep an eye out for sometime in the next 6 months. We are looking at putting up some new indexes, one which will be the index to ships 1848 to 1955, index to immigrants and crew 1909 to 1938, and registers of immigrants for the Rockhampton Depot 1884 to 1915. And they will have, at least one of those will have the digital images attached to it, so you can get your records for free. The index to ships was originally an old card index which was held in the search room, so basically we've been converting that to an online index, and where there are digital images and links, they'll be attached to it. It includes passenger lists, health officers' reports and correspondence, treasury payments for land orders, which then lead to another suite of records which we are currently indexing, and we're about 85% through. The index to ships in its old form looks something like this. So it gives you a brief description of what the record is in the old reference. So long as you have that old reference, whenever you come in, see one of the reference archivists and we can assist you to find the actual record as it's converted into the new numbers. 20th century migration, different again from 19th century migration. There are 3 main series that deal with it. These haven't been digitised as yet. And we are still item listing series 4227. We have about another 650 boxes to go. It's one of those 20-year projects. But as each box gets done, that gets loaded onto the catalogue. So that's what we say, check, check and check again, because you never know what's being added to the catalogue. So the first series, 4227, contains correspondence with the nominator, a report from the local police officer here in Queensland, medical examinations and immigrants' interviews. The other 2 series give you more information about their booking advices and passages, so definitely have a look at those. And we are almost finished. That's what some of the records look like. Nice pretty pictures, lots of family detail, and then the migrant aircraft colours look like this, and this is where you'll see they give the if they went on railway trips to and from Sydney and that. The other ones we have quickly, just so you can see what they look like. The correspondence for disembarkation, we get some details. And this is, so we said you weren't allowed to bring feather beds. In the Migrant Ship and Aircraft files, you get to find that they bring their motorbikes, their travel bags, their trunks, their toolboxes and their mattresses. And then, of course, we have Yungaba, which is where a lot of them went to before the Waco came into being. So that's pretty much my talk. I have gone a little bit over time, I do apologise. So I hope you've all learnt a bit about that, and it encourages you to come out to State Archives, have a look, hit those indexes online, constantly look at our catalogue, and if you've got any questions we might save them to the end, and I'll just hand it over now. Thank you everyone.